Hey there friends, David Lightbringer here to pick up right where we left off last time in the Egg Meets the Gods video by explaining the Crone goddess of the faith of the seven. One of these times I'm going to burn my shirt here. And also the Crone's many avatars walking the pages of A Song of Ice and Fire. And also a Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. We're going to talk about the soothsayer, fortune teller, and what her prophecies might mean. And those of you who watched the last video will know that we broke down Robin Risling and how he's both an incarnation of the warrior of the faith of the seven and also Odin of Norse mythology. So check that one out if you missed it. And again, today we're here to talk about the fortune teller and, after a spoiler warning, to attempt to decode what her prophecies for Dunk and mostly Egg could mean. We're going to get right into it, so I will just say thanks for dropping by and supporting the sort of mythical analysis that I like to do by clicking the like button and making sure you're subscribed, of course. And let's get going. Alright, so as best as I can determine, George's Crone goddess seems to be a combination primarily of the Greek Hecate and the three Norns of Norse mythology. Both of these are triple goddesses. The three Norns essentially serve their function as a collective. While Hecate may be the most well-known so-called triple goddess of classic mythology, with Hecate often being portrayed as having three heads. So this is probably where George borrowed the formulation of maiden, mother, and crone. And Hecate, triple goddess mythology in particular, has had a heavy influence on more modern ideas related to witchcraft and pop culture, witchcraft, the occult, etc., etc. And the Norns, meanwhile, well, they're responsible for tending to Yggdrasil, the world tree. That's very important. But more famously, they are known for measuring out the threads that are men's lives and deciding how long they shall be before they get snipped, how they'll be interwoven with other men's threads and lives and women's lives. You get the idea. The names of the three Norns appear to translate to past, present, and future, approximately, and they are seen as shadowy figures who only reveal someone's fate to them as it is coming to pass. In somewhat similar fashion, Hecate is associated with magic, witchcraft, necromancy, ghosts, the night, the moon, and she's also heavily associated with the idea of a crossroads, which would seem to refer again to the concept of fate and which path people take in their lives. Hecate is also very commonly depicted holding two torches, which she used to help Demeter search for her daughter Persephone in the underworld. And some stories also have Hecate staying in the underworld with Persephone because Hecate is a chthonic goddess. Or we might say that she possesses certain attributes which are consistent with underworld deities. So as I mentioned in the last video, it seems intuitive to see the Crone's lantern as being similar to Hecate's torches. They are lights that guide people's way, particularly when it has to do with navigating the difficult choices in life. So people seek out the Crone of the faith of the seven for her wisdom, which is like a light because it shows the path forward. We're also told that the Crone opened the door of death and let the first raven into the world, which implies that the Crone has powers over life, death, and resurrection, just as with Hecate and the three Norns. Now, when we're talking about the Crone, really we're talking about all the Crone figures in the story as much as we are the official goddess. After all, the gods of the faith of the seven are flat out presented to us as archetypal formulations, meaning that they're intended to embody the sorts of people that exist in real life. So as Septon Maribald explains to Brienne, the smith might as well be called the cobbler or the mason or the carpenter because he simply represents the idea of people who do work. So the figure of the smith, quote unquote, is really just a distillation of the attributes of these type of workers and craftsmen. Along the same lines, if you remember when Catelyn is praying in the Sept and she's looking at all the faces of the seven, she looks at the face of the warrior and begins to see the faces of people like Robb Stark and Jaime Lannister superimposed over the warrior. And even Arya too, because that is one of the roles that Arya plays. Arya is a Valkyrie, by the way, Valk Arya, as it were. So check out that video if you want more about Arya and Norse folklore. And so yes, there are many avatars of the Crone walking around in the story. So for example, we should think of the many wildling woodswitches who offer healing and spells and glimpses of the future, such as the woodswitch who saved Mance Rayder from the Shadowcat, or Mother Mole who led all the surviving wildlings to Hardhome in A Dance with Dragons because she saw a prophetic vision. We should think of Maggie the Frog, a Westerland's woods witch who was able to see glimpses of Cersei's future by tasting a drop of her blood. Yummy. And by the way, some people have asked if this woods witch talking to Egg might be Maggie the Frog. I don't tend to think so. I don't really see the point of that. And according to what we know about Maggie the Frog, she really should have an Associ accent. So I think this is just a rando woods witch, but let me know. And then getting back to our Crone figures in the books, there's the one-eyed crone of the Dosh Khaleen who gives Dany the prophecy of the stallion who mounts the world. And certainly we should think of Lady Stoneheart, basically an underworld death goddess given form, whose chief occupation is now deciding when people should die, just as the Norns do. Even Lady Stoneheart, having been pulled from the river by the direwolf Nymeria, evokes Hecate, because Hecate is often accompanied by a black dog of the underworld, a black dog who actually used to be a tragic Trojan queen who died and was transformed. And that's obviously very similar to Nymeria the direwolf being named after Queen Nymeria of the Rhoynar and House Martell of Dorne. We should certainly think of the ghost of Highheart as a crone figure. She shares her seashells by the seashore. She shares her glimpses of the future with Beric and the Brotherhood Without Banners, and even with Arya. And in fact, the scene where the ghost of Highheart sort of suddenly reacts to Arya's presence and starts calling her blood child is not unlike the way the seeress in A Night of the Seven Kingdoms switched from giving kind of a half-hearted generic prophecy to Dunk to getting more of a wild look in her eyes and speaking with this intensity as she gave Egg her prophecy. The ghost of Highheart is especially Norn-like because she haunts the weirwoods of the High Heart, and because she is probably a child of the forest or part child of the forest. And of course, the weirwoods are really just George's version of Yggdrasil, with the children of the forest being the ones who take care of the weirwoods, just as the Norns take care of Yggdrasil. Now, most of all, when we think of Crone characters in the books, we should think of Old Nan, whose knitting needles are certainly meant to evoke the three Norns measuring out, cutting, and, appointing the threads of mankind's fate. Old Nan's tales of the past are also foreshadowings of Bran's future, so that's kind of like a prophecy. And her stories about the others amount to giving Bran a glimpse into the realm of the dead. And then the kind of humorous point about Old Nan, getting up in the years and, all the Brans kind of run together for her, well, that just suggests her as existing outside of time, kind of like a weirwood tree, or an eternal goddess of death and fate, etc., etc. And then finally, we do see Bran and the other Stark children seeking out Old Nan for wisdom, just as men do the Crone. So yeah, Old Nan is extremely Norn-like, and if you want a lot more on Old Nan, the Norns, ice spiders, and things like that, check out the Ice Spiders video, one of my most proud accomplishments in life. And I'm really not kidding. Not kidding. And so, with all that context, it's actually pretty easy to understand the role that the soothsayer / fortune teller is playing on episode 3 of A Night of the Seven Kingdoms. When she encounters Egg, she effectively sees through his disguise and recognizes his royal blood. And just taking the prophecy at face value and in general terms, she's predicting the nature of his life's glory and also the end of his life. So pretty standard prophecy stuff there. And it does seem likely that the events at Ashford Meadow amount to some sort of crossroads for Egg's future path. And of course, by the end of the episode, we do see Egg taking an active hand in things to save Dunk from Aerion. Now, Egg, when he hears the prophecy, he doesn't know if it's an ironclad destiny that he's doomed to fulfill, or only a potentiality and perhaps a warning about what could be. This is just as it is with Stannis listening to Melisandre, and really it's just how it is for Melisandre herself, seeing these glimpses of the future in the flames. Are they things that are definitely going to happen, or things that may happen if she does or doesn't do something? She doesn't seem to be sure. And it's more or less the same situation in the House of the Undying with Daenerys. So after seeing the many visions, she asked the Undying, one of whom is a crone, "In the long hall, the things I saw, were they true visions or lies? Past things or things to come? What did they mean?" And the Undying respond, "The shape of shadows, morrows not yet made," which would seem to imply that the future is kind of murky and not totally set. Maybe it firms up a little bit as it gets closer to happening, which kind of works well as a writing device because, there is some amount of fate and there are prophecies, but each character still retains agency and responsibility for their choices. And by the way, Melisandre is a crone figure too, since she's seemingly much, much older than she appears. And as she herself says, "I can speak to kings long dead and children not yet born, and watch the years and seasons flicker past until the end of days." And just as Hecate has the power of resurrection and the crone can open the door of death, Melisandre sure seems like she is at the wall specifically to resurrect Jon Snow. So check out my Melisandre's Fate video and the Firewhite Ghost video, for my latest predictions along those lines, because I do tend to update them every couple of years when I figure something out and Winds of Winter still hasn't come out yet. So with all that said, spoiler warning, hear ye, hear ye. We're gonna decode the prophecies now, and that's basically spoiler talk. All right, let's decode the prophecies. We're ready to decode the prophecies, everyone. Okay, so here they are. To Dunk, she says, "You shall know great success and be richer than a Lannister." So the first thing I want to say is that for the most part, I think this is meant to come across as the sort of generic prophecy that she might give to anybody with a penny. "You shall know great success and become very rich" is sort of perfectly ambiguous and positive. And she delivers it in a far more casual tone than the prophecy that she gives to Egg, which definitely seems meant to come across to us, the viewers, as a real prophecy. Even still, it's not above the writers of the show to give us a little ironic foreshadowing, even in this sort of throwaway, cheap, generic prophecy that she is giving to Dunk. And it is certainly true that Dunk knows great success in life, and I guess success at Ashford Meadow in that he didn't have his foot chopped off. But overall, his greatness, yeah, he rose from flea-bottom street urchin to Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, so that's pretty great. However, so far as we know, and there are some gaps in Dunk's story, Dunk is never wealthier than a Lannister, and the point of joining the Kingsguard certainly is not to accumulate wealth. So perhaps Dunk will come into some kind of fortune and then lose it in one of the Dunk and Egg stories yet to be written, who knows? But people have also been wondering, maybe riches refers to something other than financial wealth. And although that does get pretty squishy, pretty fast, I mean, you can kind of make that mean anything. One interesting thing I saw someone point out in the live chat is that Dunk has a lot more pages in the White Book of the Kingsguard than Jaime Lannister does. And that's something that Jaime remarks upon, how few pages he has in the book when he takes a look at it. And that is certainly an interesting comparison. I don't know if that's riches, but it is an interesting comparison. Now, the one thing that did occur to me as potentially fitting this bill pertains to Lady Rohan Webber from the Sworn Sword, because she goes on to marry Sir Gerald Lannister of Casterly Rock after old Sir Eustace kicks the bucket. So she becomes Lady Lannister and actually the mother of Tytos, who is the father of Tywin. So she's Tywin's grandmother, Cersei and Jaime and Tyrion's great-grandmother. But there's a mystery here. Only 10 to 15 years after marrying Sir Gerald, and only 1 year after giving birth to her last child with Gerald, who is Jason Lannister, Rohan Webber/Lannister disappears without a trace. Perhaps this mystery has nothing to do with Dunk at all, but perhaps it does. Perhaps Dunk eventually swooped back around and picked up Rohan, and they ran away and lived in a cottage together, and maybe they even had some Dunklings. They do have to come from somewhere after all, and the Cleganes do seem to be Dunklings who originate in the Westerlands, so who knows? The key idea here is that if Gerald valued Rohan, treasured her, more than anything else in life, then Dunk swooping in to kind of steal her would make him richer than a Lannister, potentially. So let me know what you think about that. That Rohan Webber mystery is one of the more interesting dangling mysteries in the sort of more obscure lore of the story. So yeah, let me know what you think, or let me know what you think what else Dunk's prophecy could refer to. And then as for Egg, the soothsayer says this: "You shall be king and die in a hot fire, and worms shall feed upon your ashes, and all who know you shall rejoice in your dying." To which I say, some will die in hot pursuit, fiery auto crashes. Some will die in hot pursuit while sifting through my ashes. They were all in love with dying. They were drinking from a fountain that was pouring like an avalanche coming down the mountain. So yeah, I don't know if the Knight of the Seven Kingdoms writers were listening to the Butthole Surfers as they wrote this episode, but it kind of sounds like it. In any case, this is clearly a reference to Summerhall, at least judging by the tremendous amount of YouTube traffic that's come to my Summerhall video over the past few days. Thank you very much. And if you're new to the channel, welcome. Make yourself comfortable. Don't try to hatch any dragon's eggs with wildfire, please. At least not on the carpet. And so yes, again, spoiler alert, we do know that Egg does become king and he does die in a hot fire. That's not breaking any news, except to Egg. And of course, it's really nothing new for Targaryens to be laboring under the burden of prophecy as they make their life choices. And we already knew that by the age of 11, Egg is thinking about the various Targaryen family prophecies of the return of the dragons, which is something he mentions to Dunk in the Sworn Sword. So the idea of Egg getting a random prophecy about his future at Ashford Meadow really doesn't change how we see his character arc. What's really interesting and what's got all of our attention are the last lines. All who know you will rejoice in your dying. That was pretty shocking, and the potential explanations for this basically fall into two groups. Theories about his friends and family actually coming to dislike or even hate him, and the possibility that his death may have temporarily been successful in hatching dragons and thus caused everyone to rejoice, at least for a moment. So, why would Egg's friends and family potentially turn against him? Well, what we are told about King Egg's quest to hatch dragon's eggs is that he wanted the dragons to enforce his populist political reforms, which were being resisted by the various high lords of the realm. So maybe his friends and family and closest advisors also opposed those reforms, either because they believed in enforcing class privilege, or they were just sick of the controversy that his attempt to reform the laws was causing. We also know that all of Egg's children defied his wishes and his politically arranged marriages and married who they want instead. So perhaps those relationships between Egg and his kids never mended, but just got worse over time. Now, my main theory about Summerhall is that Egg was trying to hatch dragons for reasons pertaining to the prophecy of the prince that was promised, like most Targaryens. And in fact, I think that Egg thought that Rhaegar, who was born at Summerhall, was going to be the prince that was promised. And so Egg was basically trying to hatch him some dragons, potentially even by walking into the pyre himself sacrificially. And the key piece of information here is that Egg's brother, Maester Aemon, says to Sam of his brothers that the dragon dreams killed them, every one. That would seem to clearly imply that Egg was trying to make his dreams come true at Summerhall when he died. Egg very well may have grown obsessed with magic and prophecy and bringing the dragons back by the end of his life. And perhaps this is what drove his family members away. Perhaps Summerhall was like, thank God this lunatic finally put himself out of his own misery, and now we don't have to deal with him anymore. That would be a very sad end to Egg's story, so I hope that's not the case. But prophecy has been sort of tearing House Targaryen apart from the very beginning, when the prophecy of Daenys the Dreamer tore House Targaryen out of the Valyrian Empire into a lonely, smoky citadel in the Narrow Sea. The rest is history. But seriously though, think about Rhaegar trying to make the prophecy come true and also stabilize the realm, and it's just all a lot to juggle. So then finally we have the possibility that everyone rejoiced in Egg's death because he did hatch dragons. Perhaps his death was a sacrificial death. Like I said, maybe he walked into the fire, maybe he saw a vision of Dany in the future and thought it applied to him. And that certainly would be a miracle, as it was with Dany, if Egg had managed to hatch some dragons. That would have left everyone awestruck and certainly rejoicing, at least for a minute, and at least in a bittersweet fashion. So perhaps the biggest Targaryen tragedy of Summerhall wasn't even the members of the family that it killed, but the fact that it snuffed out the return of dragons in the cradle. And certainly, I hope it goes without saying, that in this type of scenario, we must once again consider Marwyn the Mage's anti-dragon Maester conspiracy, which, as all of you will know, I'm sure, alleges a long-running scheme by certain members of the Citadel to snuff out the dragons of House Targaryen. In theory, this goes all the way back to the Dance of the Dragons, the Targaryen Civil War, where most of the dragons died. If you ask Marwyn, he would tell you that the Maesters provoked that war as a means of killing the dragons. There does seem to have been Maesters as well as pyromancers at Summerhall, so maybe they had a way of blowing the whole thing up in case Egg was successful, and that's what happened. That would certainly be a shocking climax to the Dunk and Egg saga. That would be friggin' incredible. Like, oh, so close. So close. Some people have also taken note of the line about worms eating Egg's ashes and wondered, could fireworms be involved here? But I myself don't really see how that's possible or what the point would be. And I would just say that, if anything, worms/worms with a Y can simply be a way of referring to dragons. But really, I think the explanation here is that the writers were listening to Pepper. And next week, we will be live right after the episode, which will air at the normal Sunday night time. So come by the channel, look for me, Greywaste Tim, and Estella Graves talking about episode 5 it will be. And that does seem like it's going to be the action-packed big joust episode. So yeah, see you then, Sunday night. Thanks for watching. Cheers. I don't mind the sun sometimes, the images it shows.